Tonight, we are going to follow a slave through a day in early imperial Rome. And we're going to discover that being owned by another human being involves significantly more administrative complexity than you might expect. This is not the dramatic slavery of gladiatorial combat or mining operations, where life expectancy is measured in months. This is domestic slavery in a wealthy household, which means your primary dangers are not physical brutality, but rather navigating the bizarre social hierarchy of a Roman house, where your owner's teenage son technically outranks you, but also needs you to tie his shoes, and where the head cook wields more practical power than some senators, but is still legally property that can be sold at any moment. We will observe someone who is simultaneously essential to the household's functioning and legally equivalent to furniture, who must be competent enough to manage complex tasks, but never so competent that they make their owners feel inadequate, who lives in close proximity to enormous wealth while owning literally nothing, not even the clothes on their back. This is not going to be comfortable or uplifting, but it will be historically accurate and occasionally absurd in the way that only Roman society could manage. So settle in and meet someone whose name might change if their owner decides they prefer a different one, whose skills keep a household running, and whose legal status as human property creates daily contradictions that everyone simply accepts as normal. Before we step into this world, take a moment to settle in. If you enjoy these journeys into history's quiet corners, consider subscribing to join us regularly. We would love to hear where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. There is something remarkable about knowing our community spans different places and time zones, all gathering here to explore the ordinary lives that made history possible. Time for me to hand things over to Corey. He's going to walk you through everything that comes next. Corey, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Ben. Let's begin. He wakes before dawn in the small room he shares with 3 other household slaves, a space that would be considered inadequate for storage in this house, but is apparently perfectly acceptable for humans who happen to be property. The room is not quite cold, because Rome in summer is not quite cold, but it is also not comfortable, because comfort requires resources that slaves do not receive unless their comfort directly benefits their owners, and their owners are not present at dawn to benefit from anyone's comfort. The other slaves in the room are already stirring, moving through the pre-dawn routine that happens every morning with the efficiency of people who have done this exact sequence of actions for years and who know that delays result in unpleasantness. No one speaks because speaking before dawn is unnecessary, and also because conserving energy is sensible. When the day ahead will require extensive physical labor and the ability to remain pleasant while performing it, which is somehow more exhausting than the labor itself, he stands and stretches, feeling the particular stiffness that comes from sleeping on a thin mat on a stone floor, a sleeping arrangement that the household's architect probably never thought about, because architects design houses for owners, not for the 20 or 30 slaves who actually make the house functional. His tunic is where he left it, folded carefully, because taking care of your possessions is important when you own exactly one tunic, and acquiring a replacement requires either your owner's generosity or your owner's recognition. That a slave in a torn tunic reflects poorly on the household's dignity. The other slaves are dressing with the practiced speed of people who have exactly enough time to prepare themselves, and no additional time for hesitation or error. One is Marcus, who manages the household's wine supply, and who therefore has a status that would be impressive if status among slaves were not fundamentally absurd, like being the tallest building in a hole. Another is Lydia, who attends to the mistress's wardrobe and who possesses knowledge about fabric and fashion that would make her wealthy. She were permitted to own anything or charge for her expertise, which she is not. The third is Felix, who is new to the household, purchased 3 months ago to replace someone who died, and who is still learning the elaborate unwritten rules that govern how tasks should be performed, and in what order, and with what degree of visible effort. Felix makes mistakes regularly, small errors that the established slaves notice and correct quietly before the overseer or the owners can notice them. Because slaves helping each other avoid punishment is one of the few forms of resistance available to people who cannot actually resist anything. They move together down the narrow corridor that connects the slave quarters to the main house, a corridor that is deliberately separate from the corridors that family members use, because Romans preferred not to see the mechanisms that make their comfort possible, much like they prefer not to think about where sewage goes or how bread appears on tables. The main house is beginning to wake, though the family is not yet awake because wealthy. Romans do not wake at dawn unless something has gone terribly wrong. The atrium is already being cleaned by the night slaves, people whose schedule is the inverse of his own, who work while the family sleeps and sleep while the family is awake, existing in the household's shadow hours. They nod to each other in passing. Members of the same class acknowledging each other's existence in the brief moment when their schedules overlap. One of the night slaves is sweeping the mosaic floor with careful attention to the corners where dirt accumulates, and he notices that she looks tired in a particular way that suggests she is not just tired from tonight, but tired from months of nights. The cumulative exhaustion that comes from a schedule that fights against human biology. His first task is helping prepare breakfast for the family, which means going to the kitchen where the head cook, Marcellus, rules with the absolute authority of someone who controls food in a household where everyone eats, and therefore everyone must maintain positive relations with the person who determines whether their food is good or terrible. Marcellus is technically a slave and therefore technically has no authority, but practically speaking he has more power than several of the family's less important relatives, because those relatives cannot cook and Marcellus can. And this gives him leverage that he wields with the subtlety of someone who has been doing this for 20 years. The kitchen is already hot. The ovens haven't been lit by someone whose job is specifically lighting ovens, because Roman households have enough slaves that jobs can be divided into absurdly specific categories. Someone lights fires. Someone else tends fires once they are lit. A third person is responsible for ensuring, adequate fuel exists for fires that need lighting and tending. This level of specialization would be efficient if efficiency were the goal. But the actual goal is demonstrating that the household can afford to have this many slaves, making efficiency a fortunate side effect rather than the primary purpose. Marcellus is directing the morning's preparation with the focused intensity of someone who knows that the master's breakfast, arriving late or inadequately warm, will result in complaints that will cascade down through the household hierarchy until they land on whoever is most convenient to blame, which is usually whoever is newest or least able to defend themselves. This is how Roman household management works. Responsibility flowing downward while credit flows upward, creating a system where success belongs to owners and failure belongs to slaves. The breakfast being prepared is relatively simple by Roman standards, which means it involves only 4 or 5 dishes rather than the 8 or 10 that would accompany a formal meal. Bread, cheese, olives, fruit, and a warm grain porridge that will be flavored with honey and served in bowls that cost more than a year of a laborer's wages. The food itself is fine. The ingredients are quality. But the real luxury is having someone else prepare it and serve it and clean up afterward. The true marker of wealth being not what you own, but what you never have to think about. He is assigned to preparing the fruit, which means washing grapes and figs and arranging them on a platter in a configuration that is somehow aesthetically important, despite the fact that they will be eaten within minutes and the arrangement will be destroyed. But Romans care deeply about presentation, about the appearance of things, about maintaining standards that demonstrate culture and refinement. A poorly arranged fruit platter suggests barbarism. suggests a household that does not understand proper Roman values, and therefore the grapes must be arranged just so, each one positioned with care, while he arranges grapes into patterns that no one will appreciate or probably even notice. He listens to the kitchen's morning rhythm, the conversations that happen in the spaces between tasks. Marcellus is complaining about a recent dinner party where the master requested a dish that required ingredients that were not in season, apparently not understanding that seasons determine food availability and that wanting something does not make it magically appear. One of the other cooks sympathizes, sharing her own story about an impossible request, and they bond over the shared experience of serving people who do not understand the basic logistics of the services they demand. This is one of the strange aspects of slavery in a wealthy Roman household. The slaves often know more about running the household than the owners do. The owners know how to give orders and how to complain when orders are not fulfilled to their satisfaction. But the actual mechanics of making a household function, the knowledge of what tasks must happen in what sequence and how long they take and what resources they require, this knowledge belongs to slaves who have been doing these tasks daily for years or decades. Felix enters the kitchen looking uncertain, which is his permanent expression, carrying a message from the overseer about some change to today's schedule. The family is expecting guests for the midday meal, which was apparently decided last night and is only being communicated now, meaning the kitchen must adjust its preparation to accommodate additional people with no advance warning, because wealthy Romans assume that households can scale up instantly, that food and preparation simply materialize through the force of their wanting. Marcellus receives this news with a resigned expression of someone who has experienced this exact situation dozens of times and knows that complaining is useless and adapting is mandatory. He begins recalculating quantities and assignments, pulling people from other tasks, reorganizing the morning's work to accommodate this new requirement. This is what competent household management looks like from the inside: constant adjustment, continuous problem solving, managing with inadequate notice and insufficient resources because the people making demands do not consider whether their demands are reasonable. The breakfast platters are completed and arranged on trays that will be carried to the dining area by slaves whose specific job is carrying things. Because again, Roman households divide labor into categories that seem almost satirical in their specificity. He returns to his regular morning duties, which involve cleaning the family's private rooms before they wake and begin using them, ensuring that when they open their eyes, the world is already clean and ordered and pleasant, maintaining the illusion that disorder and dirt simply do not exist in properly managed Roman homes. The master's bedroom is first, a large room with a bed that could sleep for people but houses only one because wealthy Romans believed that space is a form of luxury, and that having more space than you need demonstrates that you can afford more space than you need. The room smells of perfume and wine, the remnants of yesterday's indulgences, and he works quickly to open the shutters and air out the space, removing the chamber pot, which mercifully is not as full as it could be, emptying it in the designated area and rinsing it with water and vinegar. The bed must be straightened, the covers arranged in ways that look casually elegant despite requiring careful attention to achieve. The floor must be swept, though it was swept yesterday and is not particularly dirty. But it must be swept again because the appearance of constant attention is important even when actual necessity is absent. He works methodically, performing tasks he has performed hundreds of times, his hands knowing what to do without conscious thought, his mind free to wander while his body executes the familiar routine. He thinks about freedom sometimes, though thinking about it serves no practical purpose. Freedom would mean owning his own labor, receiving compensation for his work, making decisions about his own life. But freedom is not something he can acquire through wishing or hard work or good behavior. Freedom is something that happens to slaves only when owners decide to grant it. And owners grant freedom based on their own interests, not based on slaves deserving it or wanting it or needing it. Some slaves are freed in their owner's wills, a final gesture of generosity that costs the owner nothing because they are dead, and therefore no longer benefiting from the slave's labor. Some slaves are allowed to purchase their freedom, saving tiny amounts over years or decades until they accumulate enough to buy themselves, which is a system that seems designed to be almost, but not quite impossible. Some slaves are freed as rewards for exceptional service, though what constitutes exceptional is defined entirely by the owner and can change without explanation or warning. He is young still, perhaps 25, and has been enslaved since childhood, sold to this household when his previous owner died and the estate was liquidated. He barely remembers freedom, if he was ever free, because his earliest memories are of belonging to someone else, of being property, of existing in service to others. This is simply how his life is, and thinking about alternatives does not change the reality. It only makes the reality more difficult to accept. The master's room is complete, and he moves to the mistress's room, which is similar but decorated differently, with more emphasis on fabrics and mirrors and the various implements of beauty maintenance that wealthy Roman women required to achieve the appearance of natural beauty that is actually the result of hours of effort by slaves who know techniques that their mistresses claim to understand but actually do not. The mistress's chamber pot is mercifully empty, suggesting she used the proper latrine last night. And he is grateful because emptying chamber pots is one of the less pleasant aspects of household slavery, though complaining about unpleasant tasks is pointless when you have no choice about performing them. He straightens the room quickly, opening windows to air it out, smoothing the bed coverings, ensuring everything is arranged to suggest effortless elegance. The sun is rising now, light beginning to fill the house, and he knows that within the hour the family will begin waking and the house will shift from preparation mode to active service mode, from slaves working invisibly to slaves working visibly while pretending to be invisible, maintaining the fiction that tasks complete themselves and that the family's comfort requires no effort from anyone, except the family members who generously allow themselves to be comfortable. He returns to the kitchen for his own breakfast, a meal that is eaten quickly while standing, because sitting requires time that is not allocated for slave meals. The food is simple: bread and olives and water, the same ingredients that appear in the family's breakfast, but prepared without care for presentation or taste. Because slave food is fuel rather than pleasure, functional rather than elegant, it is adequate, and adequate is what slaves receive unless something goes wrong, in which case they receive less than adequate. Because punishment often takes the form of reduced food rather than physical beating, hunger being an effective control mechanism that does not damage property the way beating does. Lydia is eating nearby, and they exchange brief comments about the day ahead, the expected tasks, the rumors about guests coming for the midday meal. She mentions that the mistress is in a mood lately, irritable and demanding, which means everyone serving her must be especially careful to anticipate her needs and avoid her displeasure. This is useful information, the kind of intelligence that slaves share with each other as survival strategy, helping each other navigate the moods and preferences of the people who own them. Felix is asking questions about how to properly fold the master's formal toga, and one of the senior slaves is explaining the technique with patient detail, showing him the specific folds and draping that create the proper appearance. Felix is learning slowly, and the other slaves are teaching him because his success benefits everyone. His failures would reflect poorly on the entire household staff, and also because helping each other is one of the few ways slaves can exercise any agency in lives defined by having no agency. Breakfast ends, and the day's main work begins in earnest. The family is waking, which means slaves must transition from preparation to active service, must be visible when needed and invisible when not needed, must anticipate requirements before they are stated and fulfill them before they become inconvenient. This is the real skill of household slavery. Not the physical tasks, which are mostly straightforward, but the social navigation, the reading of moods and preferences, the ability to be present without being noticed unless being noticed is what is required at that specific moment. The master emerges from his room looking displeased, which is his default expression before he has eaten, and heads toward the dining area where breakfast has been laid out with careful attention to appearance and temperature. He does not acknowledge the slaves who prepared his food or arranged his dining area or ensured his comfort, because acknowledging them would suggest their labor is remarkable rather than simply expected. And expected labor does not require acknowledgement. He eats while reading correspondence that another slave has already sorted and prioritized, because wealthy Romans do not sort their own mail. They have people for that. People who understand which letters are important and which can wait and which can be ignored entirely. The slave who manages correspondence is valued for this skill, though valued means the master occasionally mentions that he does good work, not that he receives any compensation beyond the basic provision that all slaves receive, regardless of competence. The mistress emerges later, attended by Lydia, who has already helped her dress and arrange her hair in the current fashionable style that requires expertise and patience, in about 90 minutes of work to achieve the appearance of effortless beauty. The mistress is in a mood, as predicted, speaking sharply to a slave who brings her fruit that is apparently not ripe enough, though how the slave was supposed to know the ripeness was inadequate is not explained, because expectations are often unclear until they have been violated. The morning progresses through its established routine, tasks flowing in familiar sequences, slaves moving through the house performing duties that maintain the appearance of effortless luxury. He is sent to the market with 2 other slaves to purchase supplies for the midday meal, a task that requires navigating Rome's crowded streets while carrying the household's money, which he is trusted with because losing it would result in severe punishment, and because slaves who have been in a household for years develop a track record that earns them access to responsibilities that newer slaves would never receive. The market is chaos, a sensory assault of sounds and smells and people, vendors shouting about their goods, buyers haggling over prices, the general crush of humanity that characterizes Roman commercial spaces. He moves through it with practiced efficiency, knowing which vendors sell quality goods, which ones inflate prices for household slaves who carry obvious wealth, which ones can be trusted to provide what they promise. The conversation shifts to gladiatorial games, an upcoming event that the guests are anticipating with enthusiasm that seems disproportionate given that they will be watching people fight to death for entertainment. They debate which gladiators are most skilled, which matches will be most interesting, whether the rumors about exotic animals being imported for the games are true. They speak about the gladiators as though they are characters in a story rather than actual humans whose actual lives will actually end in the arena. But this is apparently how Romans managed the cognitive dissonance of attending events where people die for their amusement, by treating it as performance rather than reality. One of the guests mentions having recently purchased a new slave, a Greek who is apparently very educated and who will serve as a tutor for the guest's children. The other guests congratulate him on this acquisition, discussing the value of educated slaves and how difficult it is to find truly qualified ones. They speak about the Greek slave's qualifications, his knowledge of philosophy and rhetoric, his ability to teach children properly, as though he is a particularly useful tool rather than a person who presumably did not choose to become property, but who, nevertheless, is now property and will remain property until his owner decides otherwise. He listens to this while refilling wine cups, maintaining the neutral expression that slaves learn to wear when when hearing themselves discussed as commodities, as investments, as things that can be acquired and evaluated and potentially resold if they fail to meet expectations. The Greek slave being discussed is probably highly competent, probably possesses knowledge that his owner does not possess, and is probably still legally equivalent to the cup he is currently refilling. Because Roman law does not recognize competence or knowledge or humanity as relevant factors in determining who is property and who owns property, the meal continues through additional courses, each one more elaborate than the last, the kitchen performing miracles of coordination to produce food that arrives hot, properly prepared, and beautifully presented at exactly the right moments. Between courses, servers remove used dishes and clean the table, working quickly during the brief pauses when guests are talking and not actively eating, making the table appear to clean itself, the used dishes seeming to vanish and new dishes seeming to appear without any visible mechanism causing these changes. Gaius catches his eye during one of these transitions and gives a small nod, a gesture of approval that means he is performing his role correctly, maintaining the standards that the household expects. This small recognition matters more than it should, because humans need acknowledgement from other humans, even in contexts where acknowledgement is rare and praise is rarer. Slaves develop their own internal systems of recognition and respect, evaluating each other based on competence and reliability, because the owner's evaluations are often arbitrary and based on factors that have nothing to do with actual skill. The guests have moved on to discussing their own households, comparing the number of slaves they own, the specializations they have acquired, the efficiencies they have achieved. They speak about household management with the enthusiasm of people comparing collections, proud of what they have accumulated, interested in what others have accumulated, always seeking ways to optimize their possessions. One guest mentions having recently reorganized his household staff, consolidating roles to reduce redundancy, and the others listen with interest, as though this is a fascinating innovation, rather than simply deciding that fewer slaves should do the same amount of work. The master contributes to this discussion, mentioning that his household runs smoothly due to careful selection of competent slaves and clear hierarchies of responsibility. He does not mention that the household runs smoothly primarily because the slaves have worked together long enough to develop efficient systems despite rather than because of his management. But taking credit for things that happen in your household is apparently a fundamental right of ownership. The guests nod appreciatively, complimenting him on his management skills, and he accepts these compliments with false modesty, suggesting that really he has just been fortunate in his acquisitions. The main course arrives, the centerpiece of the meal, a whole roasted pig that has been prepared in some complex fashion that makes it look almost alive despite being thoroughly dead and cooked. The guests exclaim over this display, praising the kitchen skill, the household's resources, the overall impressiveness of the presentation. The pig is carved and served, and the guests consume it with appreciation, discussing the quality of the meat and the expertise of the preparation, while slaves stand against the walls, maintaining expressions that suggest they are not thinking about how long this animal took to prepare versus how quickly it is being consumed. He notices that Felix is serving one of the guests and is slightly nervous, his hands not quite steady, his movements not quite smooth. This is understandable because Felix is new and high-pressure service is intimidating. When you are still learning and when mistakes result in consequences that are more severe than the mistakes themselves warrant, he catches Felix's eye and gives a small, encouraging nod, a gesture of solidarity from one slave to another, a reminder that everyone was new once, and that competence comes from practice, and that the more experienced slaves will help when they can. The conversation has shifted again, now covering the upcoming races at the Circus Maximus, an event that apparently commands even more enthusiasm than the gladiatorial games, possibly because watching chariots race involves less direct human death and therefore requires less cognitive dissonance to enjoy. The guests debate which teams will perform best, which charioteers are most skilled, what bets they should place. Romans bet extensively on chariot races, sometimes betting amounts that seem financially irresponsible. But when you are wealthy enough that financial irresponsibility has no real consequences, betting becomes entertainment rather than risk. The meal is entering its final stages now, the dessert course approaching, and he knows from experience that this is when guests become most relaxed, most likely to drink more wine than is wise, most likely to speak freely about topics they might otherwise keep private. The dessert arrives, an elaborate construction of honey and nuts and fruit that defies the normal properties of food to maintain structural integrity. Clearly, the result of someone in the kitchen possessing engineering skills. In addition to culinary skills, the guests consume the dessert with the same combination of appreciation and analysis that has characterized the entire meal, unable to simply enjoy food without also evaluating it, performing the role of sophisticated diners who have developed palates that can discern subtle differences in quality and preparation. One guest mentions that his own kitchen recently attempted a similar dessert and failed spectacularly, and the others laugh sympathetically, commiserating over the difficulty of finding truly skilled slaves while simultaneously acknowledging that skilled slaves are what separates successful households from mediocre ones. The meal concludes. After several hours, the guests finally replete their conversation, winding down as the food runs out and the wine begins to have more noticeable effects on their coherence. They express gratitude to the master and mistress for the excellent meal, the wonderful hospitality, the superior quality of the household service. The master and mistress accept these thanks with gracious modesty, as though hosting a meal is some generous gift they have bestowed rather than simply the expected behavior of their social class. The guests depart, escorted to the door by the master, and the household immediately shifts from service mode to cleanup mode, a transformation that happens as soon as the guests are no longer present to observe it. The dining room must be cleaned, the dishes must be washed, the leftover food must be stored or distributed. The evidence of the meal must be erased so the space returns to its pristine state, ready for the next time the family decides to demonstrate their wealth and sophistication through elaborate dining. He carries stacks of dishes to the kitchen, making multiple trips because there are many dishes and they are fragile, and breaking them would be unfortunate, both because they are expensive and because he would be held responsible regardless of whether the breakage was genuinely his fault. The kitchen is organized chaos, slaves working efficiently to process the aftermath of the meal, washing and drying and storing and organizing, transforming the remnants of consumption back into ordered supplies. Marcellus is directing the cleanup with the same focused attention he brought to the preparation, ensuring that nothing is wasted, that everything is properly stored, that the kitchen returns to its baseline state of organization. He appears tired, which is reasonable because preparing and serving an elaborate meal for guests with minimal notice is exhausting, even if you have been doing it for decades. But tired or not, the work must be completed, because there is no option to simply stop and rest when you are property, and property does not get to decide when it has worked enough. Some of the leftover food will go to the slaves, distributed according to the household's internal hierarchy, the more valued slaves receiving better portions, the less valued slaves receiving what remains after the valued slaves have taken their shares. This is presented as generosity, as the owners kindly allowing slaves to consume food that would otherwise be wasted, though the alternative interpretation is that the owners are unwilling to pay for adequate slave food and therefore use leftovers as substitute for proper provision. Saving money while appearing generous, he receives a reasonable portion, some bread and cheese and a small amount of the roasted pig, more food than the basic rations, but less food than would constitute a full meal. He eats quickly, standing in the kitchen, because sitting would require time that is not officially allocated for this purpose. And the food is good because it is the same food the guests ate, just served less elegantly and consumed with less leisure. This is one of the strange aspects of domestic slavery. You are surrounded by abundance that you cannot enjoy, constantly preparing and serving food that you can only consume as leftovers. If at all, the afternoon is approaching and he has additional tasks assigned, because the day's work does not end when a meal ends. It simply transitions to different work, the endless cycle of tasks that keep a household functioning. He is sent to help clean the master's private study, a room filled with scrolls and writing materials and the various implements of literacy that Romans consider marks of civilization and education. The study must be dusted and organized. The scrolls must be arranged in their proper order. The writing desk must be cleaned and supplied with fresh materials. He works carefully because these items are valuable and also because the master is particular about how his study is maintained, having specific preferences about organization that must be learned and remembered and implemented exactly. This is common among Roman owners. They have elaborate preferences about small details that matter intensely to them and not at all to anyone else. But slaves must learn these preferences and honor them as though they are universal laws rather than personal quirks. While cleaning, he notices a scroll that has been left open, and he can see writing in Latin, though reading it would be presumptuous and also potentially dangerous because slaves who demonstrate literacy sometimes make their owners uncomfortable, as literate slaves are harder to control than illiterate ones. He has learned to read somewhat, picking up knowledge by observation and practice, but he keeps this skill mostly hidden because advertising capabilities can lead to being given additional responsibilities without additional benefits, or worse, can lead to suspicion about what you might be reading. When no one is watching, the afternoon progresses through its assigned tasks, and he moves between different areas of the house, cleaning and organizing and maintaining, keeping the physical space in the pristine condition that wealthy Romans expect. Other slaves are engaged in their own tasks, the household operating like a complex machine where each person is a component performing their designated function, the whole producing results that the family enjoys without understanding or perhaps even noticing the mechanisms that produce them. He encounters Lydia in one of the corridors, and they exchange brief conversation about the evening schedule. The mistress is planning to attend a social event at another household, which means Lydia will need to help her prepare, selecting appropriate clothes and jewelry and arranging her hair in whatever style is currently fashionable. This preparation will take hours, far more time than the actual event will last, but appearance requires effort that must be invisible. Beauty must seem effortless, even when it is the product of extensive labor. Felix appears looking stressed, having apparently made some error that attracted criticism from the overseer. The older slaves offer quiet reassurance, reminding him that everyone makes mistakes when learning, that the key is learning from them and not repeating them, that the overseer's criticism is harsh but not personal, just the standard response to imperfection in a household that expects perfection. This is the informal support system that slaves develop, helping each other manage the stress and criticism that come with being property in a household with high standards and low tolerance for human fallibility. Though late afternoon brings a brief period of reduced activity, a pause in the day's work when the family is resting and fewer immediate tasks require attention. This is not free time exactly, because slaves do not have free time in the sense of time that belongs to them, but it is time that is less intensely scheduled, allowing for brief rest and recovery before the evening's work begins. He sits in the slave quarters for a few minutes, drinking water and letting his body rest, his feet grateful for the chance to stop moving after hours of constant motion. Other slaves are doing the same, taking advantage of this pause to recover somewhat, knowing that the evening will bring new demands and that being rested makes those demands more manageable. They talk quietly among themselves, sharing information and gossip and observations about the day, maintaining the social bonds that make their shared situation more bearable. Marcus mentions that he has been with the household for 15 years now, having been purchased as a young man and having worked his way into a position of relative trust and responsibility. He speaks about this with neither pride nor bitterness, simply stating a fact about his life, acknowledging that he has achieved as much as a slave can achieve within the constraints of slavery, which is competence and relative security, but not freedom. Never freedom unless the master decides to grant it, which is always possible, but never guaranteed. The pause ends, and the evening's work begins as the sun starts its descent, and the family prepares for their evening activities. The master is going to the baths, a daily ritual that Romans consider essential for health and civilization and social connection. He will be accompanied by 2 slaves who will assist with the bathing process and carry his belongings and generally ensure that his bathing experience is comfortable and convenient, because even basic personal hygiene is something wealthy. Romans do not perform entirely independently. The mistress is preparing for her social engagement, and Lydia is already helping her. The process of transformation from casual afternoon appearance to formal evening appearance, requiring the kind of effort that would be impressive if it were not simply expected. Multiple outfit options are being considered, each one evaluated for appropriateness and fashion and how it will compare to what other women will wear. Because Roman social events are apparently competitive in ways that extend even to clothing choices, he is assigned to help prepare the evening meal for the master when he returns from the baths. A lighter meal than the midday feast, but still requiring preparation and service. The kitchen is active again, though less intensely than during the midday rush, and he helps with various tasks as assigned, his role being generally useful rather than specifically specialized, the kind of flexible labor that households need to fill gaps in coverage and handle unexpected requirements. The evening meal is simple by Roman standards: bread and olives and cheese and wine, food that requires minimal preparation but maximum attention to presentation, because even simple food must be served elegantly. He arranges the food on platters with the same care that went into the elaborate midday display, because the household standards do not decrease just because the meal is simpler. Complexity of food does not excuse simplicity of presentation. The master returns from the baths looking refreshed and relaxed, the therapeutic effects of hot water and massage and social conversation having improved his mood noticeably. He eats his evening meal while reading more correspondence, the work of managing his various business interests and social obligations, apparently never fully stopping even during meals. The slaves serve him silently, maintaining the fiction that they are not really present, that his dining experience is private despite being facilitated by multiple other humans. The evening settles over the household, the day's work gradually winding down, though never completely stopping, because households require constant maintenance and attention. He completes his assigned tasks and returns to the slave quarters, where the evening routine mirrors the morning routine in reverse, the day ending much as it began, with tired people preparing for sleep in a small room that holds more people than it was probably designed to hold. The other slaves are settling in for the night, removing their day tunics, arranging their sleeping mats, engaging in the small personal rituals that mark the transition from work to rest. They speak quietly about tomorrow's anticipated tasks, sharing information about scheduled changes and special requirements, helping each other prepare mentally for whatever the next day will bring. He lies down on his mat, feeling the familiar discomfort of thin padding over stone floor, his body tired from a day of constant movement and labor. This is what every day looks like, has looked like for years, will presumably look like 4 years more unless something fundamental changes about his status, which is unlikely but not impossible, unlikely but not entirely outside the range of potential futures. Sleep will come soon, exhaustion overriding the discomfort of sleeping arrangements. his body demanding rest regardless of whether the conditions are ideal for rest. Tomorrow will bring similar tasks, similar challenges, similar small satisfactions of work performed competently, and similar small frustrations of being property in a household where property is expected to function perfectly with minimal resources and no acknowledgement. But tomorrow is not yet here. For now, there is only tonight, only this moment of transition between one day and the next, only the simple fact of having survived another day in a life defined by surviving. Days until something changes, or until nothing changes, and life simply continues in its established pattern until it ends. Sleep comes quickly despite the uncomfortable sleeping surface, exhaustion overriding the body's preferences about ideal conditions for rest. He sleeps deeply for several hours. It's a kind of heavy unconsciousness that comes from physical labor sustained throughout the day, his body demanding recovery time and taking it regardless of whether the mattress is adequate or the room is quiet or the temperature is comfortable. The sleep is dreamless at first, or at least without dreams he remembers. His mind simply shutting down rather than processing the day's events through symbolic narratives. This is merciful because processing the day's experiences might make sleep more difficult, might lead to thoughts about the fundamental structure of his existence that are better left unexamined, when there is nothing he can do about them anyway. Around midnight, he wakes briefly, the way people do during long sleep periods, surfacing from deep unconsciousness to lighter awareness without fully waking. He hears the breathing of the other slaves in the room, Marcus snoring softly, Lydia shifting position on her mat, Felix apparently sleeping so quietly that he makes almost no sound. These are familiar sounds, the nighttime symphony of shared sleeping quarters, and they are oddly comforting in their familiarity, proof that he is not alone. Even in a life defined by powerlessness, he becomes aware of needing to relieve himself, a biological necessity that does not respect sleep schedules or comfort preferences. The household has a latrine that slaves are permitted to use, a small room with a bench containing holes that lead to a sewage system that Romans engineered with impressive sophistication, though the sophistication is more about removing waste from wealthy areas than about providing dignity or comfort to the people using the facilities. He rises carefully, trying not to disturb the other sleepers, and makes his way through the dark corridor to the latrine by memory and touch, having made this journey enough times that he knows the path even without light. The latrine is cold and smells exactly as you would expect a shared toilet facility to smell, but it serves its function, and function is what matters when comfort is not available. Returning to the sleeping quarters, he notices that one of the night slaves is moving through the house, performing whatever tasks night slaves perform while the family sleeps. They nod to each other in passing, members of the same class, acknowledging each other's existence in the quiet hours when the owners are unconscious and slaves move through the house like ghosts, maintaining systems and cleaning spaces and ensuring that morning arrives to a house that appears to have maintained itself overnight. Back on his mat, he settles into sleep more slowly this time, his mind more active, less willing to simply shut down. He thinks about the day that passed, the guests who came and ate and discussed slaves as property with the casual comfort of people who have never questioned whether owning other humans might be morally complicated. He thinks about Felix struggling to learn the household's unwritten rules, about Lydia spending hours making the mistress beautiful, about Marcellus managing the kitchen with expertise that would make him wealthy if he were free to sell his skills rather than being property whose skills belong to his owner. He thinks about freedom, though he tries not to because thinking about freedom is painful when freedom is not something you can pursue or earn or demand. Freedom is a gift that owners give or do not give, based on their own interests and whims and calculations about what benefits them. Some slaves work their entire lives hoping for freedom that never comes. Some are freed in their owners' wills. receiving freedom only when the owner no longer benefits from their labor because the owner is dead. Some purchase their freedom, saving tiny amounts over decades, though this requires the owner to allow them to earn money and to agree to accept payment for something they already own. His own path to freedom, if there is one, is unclear. He is young enough that the household likely plans to use his labor for many more years. He is competent enough that freeing him would mean losing someone who makes the household function better. He is not specialized enough to command the kind of value that would make him worth freeing as a gesture of munificence. He exists in that middle range of slaves who are useful but not exceptional, reliable but not irreplaceable. The kind of property that owners keep because it serves them well but not so well that keeping it becomes complicated. These thoughts circle through his mind without resolution because there is no resolution available. He cannot change his status through wanting it or deserving it or working for it. His status changes only when his owner decides to change it, and his owner has no apparent motivation to make that decision. So he exists in the permanent present of slavery. Each day, similar to the last, each year passing without fundamental change. Life accumulating through repetition rather than through progress toward any chosen goal. Sleep claims him again eventually, his thoughts dissolving back into unconsciousness, his body's need for rest overriding his mind's tendency to worry about things he cannot control. He sleeps more lightly now, aware on some level of the room around him, of the other sleepers, of the progression of night toward morning, but still sleeping, still resting, still recovering from today and preparing for tomorrow. Hours pass in that strange way they do during sleep. Time both crawling and racing, subjective experience completely detached from objective measurement. The night is perhaps 2/3 over when he wakes again, this time to the sound of voices outside the slave quarters, the night overseer dealing with some issue that requires attention even at this hour. He cannot hear the specific words, but he can hear the tone. Frustrated and sharp, someone is being reprimanded for something. Some task performed inadequately, or some rule violated. He feels grateful that he's not the target of this nighttime criticism. Guilty for this gratitude, because it means being glad that someone else is suffering correction instead of him. But also unable to suppress the relief, because avoiding punishment is always preferable to receiving it. This is one of the small moral compromises that slavery requires. Being grateful for relative good fortune, even when the baseline is unfreedom. Finding comfort in small advantages, even when the overall situation is fundamentally unjust. The voices fade and silence returns, and he tries to return to sleep, but finds it more difficult now. His mind activated by the interruption, less willing to surrender back to unconsciousness. He lies on his mat, looking at nothing because the room is too dark to see anything, listening to the breathing of the other slaves, thinking about nothing in particular and everything in general, the way minds do when they are tired but not quite tired enough to sleep. He thinks about his childhood, what he can remember of it, which is not much because childhood memories fade, and also because his childhood was not particularly remarkable. He was born to a slave woman in another household, never knew his father, who was presumably also a slave, or possibly the owner, or possibly someone else entirely, was raised in the collective care of the household's slaves, who taught him basic tasks and behaviors in the fundamental lesson that he was property and would remain property unless something extraordinary happened. He was sold to this household when he was perhaps 12 years old, his previous owner having died and the estate being liquidated, slaves being distributed or sold to settle debts and distribute assets. He remembers the auction, standing with other slaves while potential buyers examined them like livestock, checking teeth and muscles and asking questions about skills and temperament and health. He remembers being purchased by this household's overseer, who selected him as generally useful labor, young enough to train and healthy enough to work for many years. That was perhaps 13 years ago. More than half his life spent in this household. Long enough that he knows its routines and its people better than he remembers his original household. The slaves he works with now are more familiar to him than his mother, whom he barely remembers, who might still be alive in some other household or might be dead. He has no way of knowing because slaves who are separated do not maintain contact. There is no system for it, and owners have no interest in facilitating it. This is another aspect of slavery that rarely gets discussed: the constant disruption of relationships. The way people who care about each other can be separated permanently because someone decides to sell or transfer property. Families exist among slaves, but they exist precariously, always subject to dissolution if it serves the owner's interests. Children can be sold away from parents. Spouses can be separated. Friendships can be ended by a decision that the people involved have no voice in making. He has avoided forming close attachments for this reason, keeping his relationships with other slaves friendly but not deep, cooperative but not intimate, protecting himself from the pain of inevitable loss. This is probably unhealthy in some psychological sense, this emotional guardedness, but it is also rational given the circumstances. A reasonable response to a situation where caring too much about people means suffering more when they are taken away. Marcus stirs on his mat, making a sound that might be the beginning of waking, or might just be sleep shifting. It is impossible to tell in the darkness. The sound reminds him that morning will come eventually, that this night will end and another day will begin, and the cycle will continue. Work and rest and work again. The endless repetition that defines his existence. He tries once more to sleep, focusing on his breathing, trying to quiet his mind. But sleep is elusive now. His thoughts too active, his body too awake. He lies in the darkness and waits for morning. Not sleeping, but resting. Not comfortable, but tolerable. Not content, but accepting. Because acceptance is the closest thing to peace available to someone who cannot change their fundamental circumstances. Time passes. The night wearing on toward dawn, and gradually he becomes aware of change in the quality of darkness. A slight lessening that suggests morning is approaching, even though true dawn is still perhaps an hour away. This pre-dawn period is the quietest time when night slaves are finishing their shifts and day slaves are not yet active. When the household holds its breath between one day and the next, he hears the first rooster somewhere in the neighborhood, the eternal optimist who believes he is responsible for bringing back the sun, announcing his achievement to anyone who will listen. Other roosters answer, because roosters apparently believe that important announcements should be confirmed by multiple sources. And the chorus of roosters marks the official end of night. Even though the sun has not yet appeared, the other slaves in the room begin to stir, responding to the roosters and to their own internal sense of when morning begins. The collective understanding that the workday is approaching and preparation must begin. Marcus sits up first, as he usually does, the earliest riser among them, and begins his morning routine. Lydia follows shortly after, then Felix, and finally he rises as well, leaving behind the mat that provided inadequate comfort for inadequate sleep, standing and stretching and preparing to begin another day that will be essentially identical to yesterday and the day before, and presumably tomorrow and the day after. There is no conversation during this pre-dawn preparation because everyone is tired and words require energy that they are conserving for the day ahead. They dress in their tunics, the same ones they wore yesterday because they each own one tunic, and washing happens on designated days that are not today. They move through the familiar motions of preparation, muscle memory guiding them through the sequence of getting ready to work. The house is beginning to wake, though the family is not yet awake because the family wakes when they choose to wake, when they feel adequately rested, when the sun has risen enough to make waking pleasant rather than unpleasant. Slaves wake when work requires waking, regardless of whether they feel rested or whether the sun makes it pleasant, because their preferences are not factors in determining their schedule. He makes his way to the kitchen, where the morning routine is already beginning. Fires being lit and water being heated and breakfast preparation starting. The collective effort to ensure that when the family wakes, their world is already ordered and comfortable. The kitchen is warm from the fires, a pleasant contrast to the cool pre-dawn air, and he stands near the warmth for a moment, appreciating it before moving on to his assigned tasks. The day is beginning again. Another rotation through the same cycle of work that has defined every day for years. There is something both depressing and comforting in this repetition. Depressing because it means nothing fundamental ever changes. Comforting because knowing what to expect makes it easier to manage. He knows what today will require, knows what tasks will need performing, knows what challenges will arise because the same challenges arise every day with only minor variations. Marcellus is already directing the morning's work, assigning tasks and checking preparations, ensuring that breakfast will be ready when the family expects it. He nods to him in acknowledgement, a small recognition of his presence and his reliability, and he nods back, accepting this minor praise because even minor praise matters when praise is rare. They work together efficiently, years of coordination making communication almost unnecessary, each person knowing what needs doing and doing it without requiring extensive instruction. The bread from yesterday is being sliced, cheese is being arranged, fruit is being prepared. The familiar elements of a Roman breakfast being assembled in familiar patterns. He performs his assigned portions of this work automatically, his hands knowing what to do without his mind needing to consciously direct them. His thoughts free to wander while his body executes the practiced routine. He thinks about the day ahead, the tasks he knows about, and the tasks that will be added unexpectedly because wealthy Roman households operate on the assumption that last-minute demands are normal, and accommodating them is simply what slaves do. He thinks about the guests who might arrive, the meals that might need serving, the rooms that will need cleaning, the endless maintenance that keeps a household functioning at the level of elegance that Romans consider appropriate for their status. The sun is rising now, light beginning to fill the house, transforming it from the shadowy space of nighttime to the bright space of daytime. The family will wake soon, and when they do, the household will shift from preparation mode to active service, from slaves working invisibly to slaves working visibly while pretending to be invisible. The familiar dance of domestic service, where the goal is to facilitate comfort while appearing to require no gay effort. Another day is beginning in the life of a slave in a wealthy Roman household. Another cycle through the familiar routine. Another performance of the role he has been assigned by circumstance and law in the fundamental structure of Roman society. He will perform his tasks competently because competence is both survival strategy and personal pride. Because doing work well is satisfying even when you cannot choose what work you do or whether you do it. He will navigate the household, its hierarchies and expectations, will coordinate with other slaves, will serve the family's needs while maintaining the fiction that service is effortless. He will find small satisfactions in work performed well, will endure small frustrations of being property in a system that values him only for his usefulness, will survive another day in a life defined by surviving days. The morning routine continues. Breakfast preparation nearing completion. The household waking to another day that will be like yesterday and like tomorrow. The repetitive cycle that defines life for both slaves and owners, though the owners call it tradition and stability, while the slaves call it nothing, because slaves do not get define the terms of their own existence. He continues his work, present in the moment, because the moment is all he has reliable access to. The past being unchangeable, and the future being largely outside his control. Today he will work. Tonight he will sleep. Tomorrow he will work again. And this pattern will continue until something fundamental changes, or until nothing changes in life. simply continues in its established rhythms until it ends. This is what it means to be a slave in ancient Rome. This endless present of work and rest and work again. This life of competence without freedom, of labor without ownership, of existence in service to others, who will never fully acknowledge that service or recognize the humanity of the person providing it. This is his reality, and he inhabits it with as much grace and skill as he can manage. Because grace and skill are the few things he can control when everything else has been decided for him. The morning progresses through its established sequence, the household moving from waking to active operation with the smooth efficiency that comes from years of repetition. The family emerges from their rooms one by one, the master first, as usual, moving through the house with the purposeful stride of someone who has places to be and business to conduct. Though his ability to have places to be and business to conduct is entirely enabled by slaves who ensure he never has to think about basic life maintenance. Breakfast is served in the smaller dining area, less formal than the triclinium used for entertaining, but still more elaborate than the simple meal would require if presentation were not considered important. The master eats while reviewing documents that another slave has prepared and organized. His morning routine requiring multiple people's coordination to appear effortless. He does not acknowledge the slaves serving him, because acknowledging him would disrupt the fiction that his breakfast simply appears and his documents organize themselves. And maintaining fictions is apparently more important than acknowledging reality. The mistress emerges later, already dressed and groomed, because Lydia has been working for the past hour to achieve the appearance of natural beauty that is actually the result of extensive effort. The mistress is in better spirits this morning, which means the household will operate more smoothly. Everyone's day is easier when the owners are content rather than irritable. She comments favorably on the breakfast, which is identical to yesterday's breakfast and will be identical to tomorrow's breakfast. But the comment is still received with quiet satisfaction by the slaves who prepared it, because positive acknowledgement is rare enough to be valued when it occurs. The day's tasks begin in earnest, the household dividing into its various functions, each slave moving to their assigned areas and responsibilities. He is sent to the market again, this time with a longer list, because the kitchen is restocking supplies after yesterday's elaborate meal depleted certain ingredients. The market trip is familiar enough to be routine, but varied enough to be interesting. The streets of Rome providing constant sensory input in the interactions with vendors, requiring enough attention to prevent boredom. Rome in the morning is organized chaos. People moving with purpose in multiple directions. Vendors setting up their stalls. Customers arriving to make purchases. The general noise and activity that characterizes a major city conducting its daily business. He navigates through this efficiently, knowing which routes are least crowded at this hour, which vendors are reliable, and which ones inflate prices for slaves they believe will not haggle effectively. The purchases are made methodically, each item selected with care, prices negotiated within reasonable ranges, everything checked for quality, because returning with inferior goods results in consequences, while returning with quality goods at fair prices results in nothing, which is still preferable to consequences. The vendors recognize him as representing the household, some of them greeting him by name, which is a small gesture of recognition that matters more than it should, because being known as a person, rather than as generic slave labor, is rare enough to be notable. One vendor, an old woman who sells vegetables, asks how he is doing with genuine interest, and they exchange brief pleasantries while she selects the best produce for his basket. This small moment of human connection, this brief interaction where he is treated as a person rather than as property, is disproportionately meaningful in a life where such moments are scarce. The old woman probably does not think much about it, probably treats all her regular customers with similar friendliness. But for him, it is a small, bright point in the general grind of serving others. The return trip to the household is slower because the baskets are heavier now. full of goods that must be transported carefully to prevent damage. He walks through Rome's streets with a practiced balance of someone who's been carrying heavy loads through crowded spaces for years, navigating around other people, avoiding obstacles, maintaining steady progress despite the weight and the chaos. Back at the household, the kitchen receives the supplies with the usual inspection and sorting, everything being checked and organized and stored appropriately. Marcellus nods approval at the quality of the purchases, which is the extent of praise he typically offers, but which is genuine recognition from someone whose standards are high, and whose approval, therefore, matters. The morning is perhaps half over now, the household operating at full activity. Everyone engaged in their assigned tasks, the collective labor producing the appearance of effortless luxury that wealthy Romans expect. He is reassigned to help with laundry, a major household task that happens on designated days and requires significant labor and coordination. Roman laundry involves water heated over fires, harsh soap that is effective at cleaning but hard on both fabric and hands, extensive scrubbing and rinsing and wringing. The laundry area is already active, with several slaves working on different stages of the process, the whole operation resembling a small factory dedicated to transforming dirty textiles into clean ones. The work is physically demanding, the constant lifting and scrubbing and wringing requiring sustained effort, and the steam from the hot water makes the area uncomfortably warm despite the outdoor location. But the work is also somewhat satisfying in its tangible results, dirty things becoming clean through direct application of effort. Visible proof that labor produces outcomes. This is one of the better aspects of domestic slavery. Unlike field slavery, where you plant seeds and wait months to see results, household tasks often provide immediate evidence of accomplishment. He works alongside other slaves in the familiar rhythm of collective labor, each person handling their portion of the sequence, the whole process flowing efficiently because everyone knows what needs doing and does it without requiring constant supervision. They talk while working, casual conversation about nothing important. It's a kind of social interaction that makes tedious labor more bearable. Someone mentions hearing rumors about a possible festival upcoming. Someone else shares gossip about another household's dramatic servant problems. Someone tells a joke that is not particularly funny, but that everyone laughs at anyway, because laughter makes the time pass faster. This is the community that slaves build among 10 cells. These informal networks of mutual support and shared experience that make their constrained lives more livable. The owners might not think of slaves as having community or relationships or social bonds, might conceptualize them as individual units of labor rather than as people with connections to each other. But slaves know better. Slaves understand that maintaining relationships with each other is essential for surviving a system that fundamentally denies their humanity. The laundry work continues for hours, the sun climbing higher and the day growing warmer, making the work even more uncomfortable, but also making the drying process more efficient. So there are trade-offs. By midday, the bulk of the laundry is complete, clean textiles hanging in the sun to dry, the dirty water disposed of, the area cleaned and organized for next week's laundry session. The slaves who worked on it are tired and damp and grateful to move on. 2 other tasks that hopefully involve less steam and scrubbing. The midday meal for the family is simpler today. No guests expected, just the household, eating together in the less formal setting they use when not performing for outsiders. The meal is prepared and served with the same attention to quality and presentation, because standards do not decrease just because guests are absent. The household's dignity requiring maintenance regardless of who is observing. He serves alongside other slaves with a practiced coordination that makes service appear seamless, anticipating needs before they are stated, refilling cups before they empty, removing used dishes during conversation pauses. The family discusses their afternoon plans, the master mentioning business meetings he must attend, the mistress planning to visit a friend. their children, each having their own activities that will require slave attendance and facilitation. This is normal for wealthy Roman families. They have elaborate schedules, full of social obligations and business activities and leisure pursuits, all of which require slave labor to make possible, but none of which are conceptualized as being dependent on that labor. The family apparently believing they are independently managing their complex lives, rather than being enabled by dozens of other people's work. After the meal, the afternoon brings a shift in the household's rhythm, the family dispersing to their various activities. Slaves transitioning from collective tasks to more independent responsibilities. He is assigned to help clean and organize the household's small library, a room containing scrolls and books that represent significant wealth because literacy materials are expensive and having a dedicated room for them is a luxury that only wealthy households can afford. The library must be dusted carefully because the scrolls are fragile and valuable. The shelving must be organized according to the master's preference for categorization, which is complex and particular and must be learned and remembered. He works methodically, handling each scroll with care, returning it to its designated position, maintaining the order that the master expects to find when he enters this room to select reading material or to impress visitors with his intellectual possessions. Working alone in the library gives him rare privacy, or at least as much privacy as a slave can have in a household where technically nothing belongs to you, including your time. He appreciates these moments of solitary work, the absence of constant supervision or coordination with others, the ability to work at his own pace without needing to match anyone else's rhythm. This preference for occasional solitude might be unusual among slaves who generally value community and connection, but he has always been somewhat comfortable with his own company, finding respite and quiet that others might find lonely. The afternoon wears on, the sun beginning its descent, shadows lengthening across the house's courtyard. The family returns gradually from their various activities, the household's energy shifting again as dinner preparation begins and the evening routine approaches. He helps set up the family's private bath, heating water and preparing oils and towels, ensuring that when they choose to bathe, everything is ready without delay. The Romans have made bathing into an elaborate ritual that combines hygiene with social interaction and leisure. Public baths being major social centers where Romans gather and conduct business and maintain relationships. But wealthy families also have private bathing facilities in their homes, smaller than the grand public baths, but still requiring significant infrastructure and slave labor to operate. The water must be heated to the right temperature. The oils must be properly mixed. The towels must be clean and warm. The whole experience carefully orchestrated to provide relaxation and cleanliness simultaneously. He performs these preparatory tasks with the same careful attention he brings to all his work, because competence is both professional pride and survival strategy. Doing things well, being important regardless of whether anyone notices or acknowledges the quality of the work. The family will bathe and feel refreshed, and probably will not think about the labor that made their refreshment possible. But he knows, and knowing is its own form of satisfaction, even when external recognition is absent. Evening approaches, and the household gains its transition toward night. Dinner being prepared and served, the family eating together again in the familiar pattern of Roman domestic life. The meal is pleasant, but not elaborate. The conversation is light. The overall atmosphere is relaxed in the way that evenings can be when nothing urgent is pending and no one is in particularly bad mood. This is probably as good as life gets in a Roman household for slaves when the owners are content. The work is steady, but not overwhelming, and no crises require emergency management. After dinner, his tasks wind down toward the day's conclusion, final cleaning being completed, everything being prepared for tomorrow's first cycle. The kitchen is organized for morning, the dining areas are cleaned and ready. The household is returning to its baseline state of preparation. He performs these final tasks efficiently, his body tired but his mind satisfied with a day of work completed adequately, competently, without major errors or problems. The slave quarters beckon, the small room with the thin mats offering the promise of rest, even if not the promise of comfort. He makes his way there as the household settles into its evening rhythm, the family retreating to their private spaces, the slaves finishing their final duties and gradually disengaging from the day's labor. The other slaves are already preparing for sleep when he arrives, removing their day tunics, settling onto their mats, engaging in the quiet evening conversation that marks the transition from work to rest. They discuss tomorrow briefly, confirming what they know about the schedule, sharing any information that might be useful, helping each other prepare mentally for whatever the next day will bring. Felix mentions that he thinks he is finally understanding the household's routines, that the tasks are making more sense now, that he feels less constantly anxious about making mistakes. The other slaves offer encouragement, confirming that yes, it does get easier with practice, that everyone struggles initially, that competence comes from repetition and observation and patience. This is the informal mentoring that happens among slaves, the knowledge transfer that the household does not formally provide, but that occurs anyway because competent slaves benefit everyone. Lydia shares that the mistress complimented her today on the hair arrangement, a rare direct praise that she is clearly pleased about, even though she knows that compliments do not change her fundamental status or improve her material conditions. But humans need recognition, need to feel that their efforts are noticed and valued. And even small acknowledgments matter when they are rare. The other slaves congratulate her, genuinely happy that she received this recognition, because her success is in some small way their success. Her good standing with the mistress potentially benefiting them all through association. Marcus is quieter tonight, looking tired in a way that goes beyond normal end-of day fatigue. And when someone asks if he is well, he mentions that his back has been bothering him lately, the accumulated strain of years of physical labor beginning to manifest in chronic pain. This is concerning because a slave who cannot work effectively is a slave whose value to the household decreases, and decreased value can lead to being sold to a household with lower standards or worse treatment, or, in extreme cases, to being discarded entirely is no longer useful. The other slaves offer what help they can, suggesting remedies they have heard about, offering to help with his heavier tasks when possible, expressing the solidarity that is all they can offer when none of them have resources or power to actually solve each other's problems. This is the limit of slave community. They can support each other emotionally and practically within very narrow constraints, but they cannot change the fundamental structure that creates their shared vulnerability. He settles onto his mat, the familiar discomfort of thin padding over stone floor barely registering anymore, because familiarity makes anything tolerable eventually. His body is tired from the day's work, his muscles aching in the specific ways that result from sustained physical labor. His feet sore from hours of standing and walking. But this is normal. This is every night, and the tiredness is actually somewhat pleasant, because it means sleep will come easily and deeply. The room darkens as the small lamp is extinguished, the last light of day fading from the windows. Night settling over the household like a blanket. The other slaves quiet their conversations, settling into their own preparations for sleep. The collective energy of the room winding down toward rest. He lies in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the slave quarters at night, breathing in small movements in the general quiet that precedes sleep. His mind wanders through thoughts about the day that passed and the day that will come, about the work that defines his existence and the small satisfactions that make that work bearable, about the life he lives and the alternative lives he will never live, because slavery is not something you escape through wishing or deserving or working hard. Sleep begins to pull at him, that heavy feeling that starts in his limbs and spreads through his body. Consciousness beginning to blur at the edges as exhaustion overrides the discomfort of sleeping conditions. He lets it come, surrendering to the biological need for rest, trusting that tomorrow will come whether he is ready for it or not, and that he will manage it the way he has managed every day before it, with competence and endurance, and the small grace that comes from doing difficult work as well as it can be done. This is his life. These cycles of work and rest, these days that blur together in their similarity, this existence in service to others will never fully see him as human, despite depending on his humanity to function. He has no grand aspirations because grand aspirations are not available to slaves. Has no long-term plans because long-term planning requires control over your future that he does not possess. He is only today, only this moment, only the immediate task and the immediate rest that follows it. And in this moment, lying on a thin mat in a small room shared with other people who are equally constrained and equally human, preparing for sleep after another day of labor in a household that needs him but does not value him, he finds something approximating peace. Not happiness exactly, because happiness is probably too much to expect from his circumstances. Not contentment, because how can you be content with being property? But something like acceptance. Something like the peace that comes from surviving another day in a life that consists entirely of surviving days. The others are sleeping now. Their breathing falling into the slower rhythms of unconsciousness, the room settling into the deep quiet of night. He joins them in this surrender to sleep, his mind releasing its grip on waking thoughts, his body claiming the rest it needs to continue functioning, his whole self accepting the temporary respite that night provides. Tomorrow, he will wake before dawn and begin again. Will move through the familiar tasks with familiar competence. Will navigate the household's expectations and hierarchies. Will find small satisfactions in work performed well and will endure small frustrations of being property in a system that fundamentally denies his humanity. Tomorrow will be like today and like yesterday and like the day before that. The repetitive cycle that defines his existence. But tomorrow is not yet here. Tonight there is only sleep, only rest, only the temporary peace of unconsciousness where status and servitude and the constraints of slavery all fade into the general darkness where nothing matters except the simple biological fact of a body recovering from work and preparing to work again. He sleeps deeply and completely in the darkness that makes no distinction between slave and free, in the night that grants rest to everyone regardless of their daytime status, in the hours where he is simply a human being sleeping rather than a slave serving. And in this sleep there is dignity, the fundamental dignity of being alive and resting and existing, which no law and no owner and no social system can entirely eliminate no matter how hard they try. The night holds him gently. The darkness is kind, and he rests in the small peace that is available to him, which is enough because it has to be enough, 'cause enough is all that anyone gets, and he takes what he can and survives and continues to sleep. Rest, the end of one day, the preparation for the next, the eternal cycle of human existence, complicated by slavery, but not defined entirely by it, because beneath the legal status and the social constraints and the daily indignities remains something irreducibly human, something that endures through centuries of attempted dehumanization, something that persists in seeking rest and peace in small moments of grace. Even in the most constrained circumstances, he sleeps, and the night continues, and tomorrow will come, and he will face it because he always faces it, because survival is what he does, because beneath everything else, he is a person who endures, and that is enough. It has to be enough. It is enough.